So basically what I'm going to talk about today is really connected to what we've already heard about, and especially to Aya's presentation, which basically is going to look at Egypt as well, but more through the lens of haunting. And it's basically based on a book project that tries to think about the afterlives of Egypt's anti-colonial project and Egypt's moment of decolonization. And the book does this through an imagined conversation between Antonio Gramsci and Frantz Fanon around questions of anti-colonialism, resistance, and liberation. But what I'm going to talk about today is a part of the basically a part of the book that uses haunting as a lens through which to think about the afterlives of Egypt's anti-colonial moment and the afterlives of Nasserism in particular. And the reason that I think this is an interesting exploration to do through the idea of haunting is because I found it a very interesting concept through which to see how politics from one project can easily seep into projects that come afterwards, but that also takes us away from the linear kind of teleology of causality and trying to understand how the past influences the present. And so for me, thinking of Nasserism through the lens of haunting allowed me to instead trouble the binaries and the historical divisions we often see between political projects, and instead to see how the power of the anti-colonial moment was precisely its ability to haunt the present in a whole variety of ways. In her amazing book, Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon seeks a new way of knowing, one that is more than listening or seeing, but that instead searches for what is still among us in the forms of what she calls ghostly matters. And she says, haunting is frightening in that it registers and brings to the surface the harm inflicted or loss sustained by social violence happened in the past or in the present. So she writes, it seemed to me that haunting was precisely the domain of turmoil and trouble, that moment when things are not in their assigned places, when the cracks and rigging are exposed, when the people who are meant to be invisible show up without any sign of leaving, when disturbed feelings cannot be put away, when something else, something different than before, seems like it must be done. So for Gordon, studying social life means confronting the ghostly aspects of it. And she uses haunting to explore the hidden, the invisible, the lingering, the unmeasurable. And I think in doing so, she raises really interesting questions about what we consider real knowledge, but also, and especially pertinent to my project, how we can account for the afterlives of certain political projects. And it's those afterlives that I'm particularly interested in. So I don't know how many people might know about the history of Egypt, but just to give a brief account of the Nasserist project, which of course was formed around Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers. And this project, of course, was created and flourished within a particular historical moment of decolonization, during which, of course, the global, national, and local kind of boundaries of what was politically possible were constantly shifting and opening up in really interesting ways. Nasserism mobilized anti-colonial nationalism, independent and state-led forms of industrialization. And of course, this mirror changes across the African continent and the rest of the post-colonial world. In many ways, the Nasserist project predated Nasser himself, and I think it's important to note that it was formed against the backdrop of intense social movement and intense activism that led up to 1952. So although the project itself can be traced to the early 50s, I think the groundwork for it, especially through imaginings of independence and anti-colonial nationalism, actually came much earlier. And so key events that I think characterize this project include economic policies such as nationalization, so the nationalization of the Suez Canal, for example, the adoption of positive neutralism, land reform, the expansion of the public sector, and all of these types of interventions into the economy and political life that aimed to kind of break or de-link Egypt from global post-colonial capitalism. Of course, as we know, this control in many ways was quite limited, and as Fanon and many others have written, what it often did was shift kind of power and intervention from the colonial to the post-colonial state. So what really interests me is the ways in which Nasserism's afterlives continue to haunt Egypt today, and also the ways in which Nasser as a figure continues to linger in the Egyptian public imagination. And I think haunting is a really interesting way through which to think about this. And what I try to do in my work is also to think about haunting as something that works through both promise and failure. And to me, it's interesting that haunting is kind of split between these two realities in Egypt. On the one hand, it's the social violence and the failures of the Nasserist project that continue to haunt Egypt today. But at the same time, I argue we can also see the promises that Nasserism made, and that kind of the political openings that happened at that moment also have had interesting effects on how Egyptians are able to imagine what liberation might mean. So I'm going to quickly go through these two kind of dimensions of haunting. So the kind of through promise and failure. And I'm going to start through how the Nasserist project and its violence against the left and against particularly is something that had very clear ramifications into the future. So in her memoir, Egyptian communist Arwa Saleh uses the term stillborn to describe how her generation of Egyptian leftists related to the Nasserist project, a project that they saw as unfinished, and one that they saw as haunting the present. And she writes, I felt profoundly disconnected from the national struggle that haunts every sentence of this book. This national struggle was a historical necessity for liberation era communists. Both second and third wave communists were hopelessly trapped in the logic of anti-imperial nationalist populism, and forced to lead a double life that destroyed both their integrity and their ability to believe. And here, I write a little bit about kind of the programs of disappearances and imprisonment that we've seen over the last 50 years in Egypt, but particularly the ways in which Nasserism as a project de-radicalized and attempted to exert quite a lot of control over the Egyptian left. And despite this, and so despite the kind of very tenuous relationship Nasserism as a political with the left, what's quite interesting is the contradiction that we see where there was still what Saleh calls a continuing loyalty towards the Nasserist project on the part of many radical forces. And this predicament, I think, can be explained in many different ways, but especially through the fact that at this particular historical moment, where anti-colonialism and independence were seen as the most urgent political projects, for many leftists, Nasserism seemed to represent the most likely possibility of achieving them. And so Saleh writes, Egyptians were caught up in a nationalist movement that ultimately destroyed it. The Nasserist vision got all tangled up with Marxism, and it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between the two until well after the floodwaters had receded, end quote. And just to finish this part, I think a really crucial point to make here, and that Sara Salem makes actually in her introduction to this memoir, is that this was the left that was inherited by Anwar Sadat in 1970, right? So when Nasser passes away and we see the shift towards free market capitalism in Egypt in the early 70s, I argue that actually one of the major afterlives, ironically, and it's almost a contradiction to the Nasserist project, is that the left was unable and had been weakened to such an extent that it wasn't as able to launch an attack on these neoliberal reforms that we see come up in the 1970s. So Sadat's corrective revolution and his purges against leftists, but also his rolling out of austerity and new forms of economic restructuring, actually are in many ways possible because of what we see happen to the left in the 50s and 60s. So while the ghosts of Nasserism are many, I think his exclusion and de-radicalizing of the left is definitely something that had these very contradictory effects going into the 70s. Going to quickly turn now to the idea of how the promises of Nasserism, I think, also haunt Egypt in ways that have actually slowed down the neoliberal shift that took place in the 70s. And I do this by showing how the transition to neoliberalism in Egypt, or free market capitalism, although narrated quite neatly in a lot of histories, was not as seamless as presented, and that actually the free market orthodoxy as an ideological project, I think, was never able to successfully challenge the Nasserist version of state-led capitalist development, and that the Nasserist idea of how to structure an economy actually quite successfully set the parameters within which economic debates could take place in the 70s and 80s. So here I ask, what happens when haunting has contradictory effects? Can haunting also work through producing liberatory effects, basically? And I think about how the Nasserist project has haunted Egypt in ways that have also slowed the encroachment of the neoliberal project, thereby stalling disastrous economic, social, and political effects that it would eventually bring with it. Precisely because although Nasserism didn't quite succeed in its own stated goals of social justice and Arab socialism, it did normalize certain notions of how a national economy should work. And I think we can see this quite clearly in how, for example, workers mobilize these ideas throughout the many strikes that begin to build up from the 1980s onwards. So just to wrap up, I think this quote from Derrida is really interesting and actually quite timely for what's happening in the world today as well. He says capitalist societies always heave a sigh of relief and say to themselves, communism is finished. And not only is it finished, but it didn't take place. It was only a ghost. They do no more than disavow the undeniable itself. A ghost never dies. It remains always to come and to come back. And so this ghost in Egypt, I think, came back both in the form of the particular promises that Nasserism made, but also in the ways in which Nasserism approached questions of radical democracy and socialism more broadly. And so I think to write stories of exclusions and invisibilities is to write ghost stories. And what Gordon gives us is a critical language through which we can talk about how historical structures and historical events continue to haunt the present. But if for Gordon, the ghost is mainly a symptom of what is missing, I've argued here that the ghost in this story of Egyptian decolonization is both a symptom for what has failed and the social violence embedded within politics, but it's also a symptom for promises that were made but never delivered. And so ghosts can also represent alternative roads that were never traveled down, but that were nonetheless imagined as possible at a certain moment in time. And so perhaps haunted histories don't disappear because they are either incapable of doing so, or they persist until we succeed in creating the world that they deem unfinished. And yeah, I think I'm going to end there. I hope that was clear enough because I know my connection's going in and out. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed all of the presentations so far, and I'm looking forward to coming back when I finish my class.